Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Good morning, Dan.
Just like old times.
That's right. Back in the studio together.
Yeah, we're doing a project together, and we decided to go ahead and record a show for you, just like we used to back in the day when we used to go to the Capitol Theater. Now we are side by side again.
And now I get to shoulder check you out of the way of the mic again.
Yeah, a little different, but it's easy to remember how it used to go.
That's right. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about farm food safety, and I wanted to let you know we have some programs coming up in regards to farm food safety. And so mark your calendars if you're in our local listening area for April 18th from 1 to 4, and that one will be over in Somerton, Ohio. And then on May 4th, here in Wheeling, we're going to have one in the evening. So mark your calendars. We'll send out some more details on those coming up. But today, we're going to talk a little bit about how to make sure that you are harvesting clean, healthy food for you and your family, as well as for sending into the market.
Yeah, food safety, it's people don't think about it. And it's nice that we don't have to think about it because a lot of our producers and the people that prep our food are aware of these things. And it's just nice to have the luxury of a lot of people that handle our food to be aware of these things. These trainings that we are doing, one, it's just a good reminder, with repetition comes better management, just better practices in general. Hearing something twice never really hurts. In fact, it just reinforces, and sometimes you gain more appreciation for it. You see it in different ways. But it is something that I think about as a luxury that as consumers, we don't always worry too much about this.
Right. And honestly, the only time anyone ever thinks about foodborne illnesses is when they're suffering from one. And honestly, most of the foodborne illnesses aren't even reported because, how often do you go to the hospital because you ate something and your stomach's upset? Usually hospital visits are the only record of foodborne illnesses. And so often our foodborne outbreaks go underreported. And also it's really hard to tie back an illness to a food source. So typically when you're looking at different bacteria, different things that get you sick, there's a lag time, right? So, if you have staph, that's pretty immediate. You ate it, 2 hours later, you feel horrible. But if you're looking at E. coli or salmonella, that's going to take some time to build up in your system enough to really make you sick. It still can be there and having an effect, but by the time you go to the doctor, you really forgot what you ate 5 days ago.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and introduce some of the agencies responsible for the regulations of food safety. At a state level, you're going to have your Department of Agriculture. But even at the county level, the health department can actually be a little bit more strict than the state guidelines. So it's very important to know what your local regulations are so that you are abiding by the safety standards and you're doing things as designated by the authority overseeing where you have your farmers markets, where you're prepping the food, where you have your restaurants to keep people safe. And as we said earlier on the show, it's a luxury, I think, that we have such good standards that a lot of people don't even think about that kind of stuff when they are consuming food.
Right. I mean, the United States does have one of the safest food systems in the world. So we're doing our best to make sure that we keep it that way. And, back in, I think it was 2011, when the Food Safety Management Act updated our food safety standards, which hadn't been done since the 1920s. So it was actually a really good thing that they did this, because our food system has completely changed since then, right? We no longer grow the majority of our own food. We purchase it. It gets shipped across the country. Sometimes it gets shipped across multiple countries. And these food safety standards that were put in place through the Food Safety Management Act, they're international. So they affect all of the food that you consume here in the United States. So when you are a farm, the guidelines kind of vary a little bit, not necessarily the guidelines, but the regulations around you vary a little bit. So the super large farms are going to have much stricter regulations because they need them, right? They're big, they process a lot of food, and if they have an error, a lot of people are going to get sick. When you get down to our small farms, a lot of them are actually exempt from the Food Safety Management Act or the Produce Safety Rule that's a part of the Food Safety Management Act. Now, if you are a small farm and you want to be registered as qualified exempt, meaning that you're too small to have to comply with the legal guidelines, you do need to submit an annual form to your state's Department of Agriculture. I believe it's called a food safety affidavit, but it is something you need to complete annually. So if you're a small farm and you grow produce, but you sell less than approximately $25,000 of produce every year, and that is gross sales, then you are qualified exempt. Now, this has been adjusted for inflation, and so the $25,000 is probably up to like $29,000 or $30,000 by now. So adjusted for inflation, you have a certain limit of sales that you can have for fresh produce. Now, when you are calculating your sales, there's another break at $500,000. So if your farm sells more than $500,000 worth of agricultural products, this includes livestock. So if you are selling meat and produce, then you can fairly quickly get to that 500,000 mark. And again, remember, it is gross sales, not profit. So you might be only making $2,000, but if you're selling $500,000, well, first of all, we need to talk about your bookkeeping and your risk management and get you a better profit margin. But just for fun, let's just say you're not making a whole lot, but you're selling a lot. You still fall under those rules and regulations if you are over that mark. So if you're not sure, reach out to your local extension office or your local Department of Agriculture, whoever is running the produce safety program for your state, and talk to them. Ask them about the details. We partner with the Department of Agriculture and the Produce Safety Alliance, which is the national program that trains all of the produce safety people in all the states. And so we're all working together. We're all trying to make this easier to understand for farmers, and we're here to help you interpret these really complicated federal rules so that you know how it impacts your farm.
Okay, so you know the federal authority for food safety, and I wasn't sure what it was, and now I just learned. So that's
that's nice. What I'm here for. We share, we learn from each other all the time.
Well, I think everybody, if they don't, they should. When you talk to people every day, there's an opportunity to learn something new. So when we talk about food safety, we talk about the food chain and how it goes from farm to table. We have farmers, and Karen did talk about the producers, whether you're a small producer or a large producer. They're going to be distributors. There's going to be the retailers. The restaurants will also fall into this category. And of course, consumers. You know, as consumers, we don't typically think too much or at least worry about food safety as far as anything before we were handling it. Obviously, when we handle it, there is certain food safety measures that we have to keep in mind, such as cutting vegetables, cutting meat on the same cutting board. That's a big no-no. See, my wife doesn't even like to see me bring meat close to anything other than meat. She makes me wash my hands in between jobs, we'll say, in the kitchen.
That's good for her. That's a good thing.
So I guess my point with that is, even though we don't think about it, we probably do.
Right, because it's ingrained, right? It's part of just what we do. And for most farms, it's ingrained as well. And you have to think that most food contamination happens at the time right before it goes into your mouth. So it's really important to note that you have a responsibility as the consumer to make sure you're washing your fruits and vegetables, make sure that you're washing your hands when you're preparing them. So those are your steps for food safety as a consumer. And everybody is a consumer, right? Because we all eat. But from a farm perspective, it's very similar steps. You need to wash your hands before you harvest. You need to make sure that your wash water and your irrigation water have certain standards of cleanliness so that you're not contaminating produce as you're growing it and harvesting it. So these are all things that we work on together.
Yes, and washing your hands is very important because there are places in our bodies that have certain bugs. We'll go with E. coli, for example. So E. coli does appear in parts of our bodies, but it's not something that you want to consume, right? So washing your hands is very important to make sure E. coli doesn't go where it shouldn't, and it can make you sick, right? As an example, just kind of, we think about bacteria, and bacteria will replicate, and it's an exponential. So the example with E. coli is that it does reproduce every 20 minutes. So if you start with 1, 20 minutes later, you have 2, 40 minutes later, you have 4, 60 minutes later, you have 2, 4, 6, 8, and 12 hours later, you can have 1 trillion. So it's, you think, oh, that's 12 hours. I mean, you could store it improperly. The idea is to keep it from inoculating to begin with, right? So we wash our hands so that one bacteria doesn't fall on something it shouldn't. And then when that thing falls on something it shouldn't, we don't cook it. The E. coli doesn't die. And now it goes from one place to a place where it shouldn't, and it can make us sick. That's just one example of a foodborne illness that we worry about as far as microbiology goes. We have salmonella, which is another bacteria. The norovirus, which is a virus, makes a lot of people sick. And all these things can be prevented by good hygiene, washing your hands, handling food properly, and not putting something where it shouldn't go.
Right. And, let's think about the impacts of these different things. So norovirus is probably the most common foodborne illness in the world, or at least in the US. But norovirus doesn't always send you to the hospital. You just feel terrible. You're probably having some vomiting and diarrhea. It doesn't take much for norovirus to make you sick. An infectious dose is less than 10. Whereas when you're looking at salmonella, an infectious dose needs to be between 1,000 and 10,000. One of the long-term worst-case scenarios for salmonella is reactive arthritis, and that can really just make your life very uncomfortable. But E. coli, when you're looking at that, a minimum infectious dose is 10 to 100, and that's, little teeny tiny bacteria, 10 to 100 bacteria, and that can actually lead to kidney failure and some really long-term health impacts. That's why we hear about that one so much, because it is one of the more impactful things if you do have to deal with it. And then you look at listeria. Listeria is actually fairly common on a lot of things. It grows naturally in the soil, and it's out there. Infectious dose is 10 to 100. And listeria's worst case scenario is it can lead to death or miscarriage. That one's one that when I was pregnant was really paranoid about. I would not eat cold lunch meat. I just wouldn't. I couldn't even stand looking at it or touching it because I was so scared of listeria. Hepatitis A is another one you may have heard about. We get outbreaks of hepatitis A every so often. And minimum infectious dose, again, same as listeria, is 10 to 100. This can lead to jaundice, liver disease. Now, the thing is, with all of these, there's a very clear connection between what comes out of a human and what goes in the mouth of a human. In our food safety trainings, we always call this poop to mouth disease, and no one wants that. So these are all fecal oral contaminations, and it doesn't have to be direct. It doesn't have to be from your butt to your hand. It can be from someone's hand to your lettuce. And then if you haven't washed the lettuce, it's really hard to get these contaminations off once they're on. But we all have to do our little part. We all have to make sure that we're taking our steps to prevent people from getting these different illnesses.
And the difficult thing about lettuce, at least in this country, is that we like to eat it fresh. We don't cook it. So when it does get contaminated, it stays there, right? And if the temperature conditions are correct, are adequate, you saw how fast it can get to 1 trillion in 12 hours. And then when we talk about the process of farming, the producers, the handlers, the transportation, everything before it gets to our table, that 12 hours probably is going to be minimum as far as going from a farm to a table. So if you have contamination early on, that's usually where you're going to have the most problems, especially with things that you don't cook. For instance, if you did cook a contaminated vegetable, it might kill the bacteria and you might be fine and you would never know. But eating it fresh does pose a greater threat. So when you are handling it, like we were talking about, when you're working with meat, or if you're handling fresh vegetables that you're going to eat without cooking, be a little bit more attentive and wash your hands a little bit more frequently, because you're not going to cook it. And that cooking step can be a good thing for food safety.
Right. And when you're starting from the farm, we use a lot of manure on farms because it is a fantastic fertilizer. And we also raise livestock, especially in our small farms where we're multi-purpose farms where we have livestock and produce production. So that manure is a great fertilizer source, but there's the right way to use manure and a wrong way to use manure. And the wrong way is to side dress lettuce with fresh manure. Just no. Because that manure, in order to be able to be safe on a produce crop, it needs to have aged and properly decomposed so that any bacteria or viruses that are living in it that can affect a human have had time to die off. And so you have to heat it to a certain temperature, or you have to wait a certain amount of time. The U.S. Organic Standard is 120 days between raw manure application and harvest. So if you're harvesting a crop that only takes, let's say, 60 days to mature, then that fresh manure, the day you planted, is still potentially going to contaminate that crop. And so that is too short of a time. You need a longer crop. But you also want to think about how things spread. So your feet and your hands are probably two of the greatest spreaders of pathogens because you walk through stuff. How many of you have gone to a park that was near water and stepped in goose poop? I mean, you can't not, if there's a lot of geese there. And so that's now on your shoes and you're tracking that along with you. So let's just say you happen to walk through some manure or scat, if it's from a wild animal, on your way into your produce field. You are tracking that with you. And depending on the rain conditions, if it rains and splashes up, it can splash that fresh manure up onto your plants. So these are things that farmers have to be aware of. And a lot of farms take really good steps. In fact, most farms do. It's just like washing your hands. You don't really think about what you're doing. But what the Produce Safety Alliance is trying to get farmers to do is actually start paying attention to all the things they're already doing. And that way they can identify what they're already doing and what they can do better. It's sort of it is a risk analysis system where you are assessing the potential food safety hazards that are on your farm or in your garden for that matter. And, you're looking at manure, you're looking at irrigation water, and of course, you're looking at the people because the people are the most controllable option of all.
Nothing is without risk, right? So with food safety, we always try to reduce risk and do things that will hopefully keep us the safest. When we talk about risk mitigation, let's talk about side dressing manure because that's a good one. And you mentioned side dressing lettuce with fresh manure. So let's think about lettuce for a second. Lettuce is a short crop, grows very close to the ground. It has a lot of little crevices. A splash will get pretty much to the top of the lettuce head. If we're talking about something like corn, because people do side dress corn with manure, but corn is typically cooked, unless it's sweet corn.
I still cook my sweet corn. I have never eaten raw corn in my life.
Well, you can eat fresh sweet corn, but it's not as typical, right? Typically, it's cooked. I shouldn't have even said that. Like, forget that avenue altogether. But even if you didn't cook it, it's still higher off the ground. So you have to think about everything when you're doing these practices, and you have to look at your product, think about how it's consumed, how it's handled, and then make the best decision for your consumer. And another part of food safety is a traceability. So how much risk do you want to take on for yourself? Because the last thing you ever want to do as a farmer is make somebody sick and have it traced back to something you did, a missed call that you made. And that's just a terrible feeling. You can never be 100% safe, but you can do things that are a little bit safer than other things. You can make those decisions for yourself, but it all goes into play. How is it consumed? How high is it off the ground? What are the tools that I'm using, let's say, to side dress or to harvest? Am I washing my hands enough? Are my baskets clean? Right? That's a big one. And how often are we thinking about washing our basket? We wash our hands, but the baskets, they sit on the ground. We track goose poop on the ground, as Karen was saying, and it's not something we always think about. So it's always good to step back and figure out the points where you could have contamination, and every improvement is a step in the right direction.
Exactly. And that is why there are so many people who are qualified exempt who take the food safety management training, which is the produce safety grower training. And they take it just because they want to do the right thing. They want to make sure that they are doing everything possible to keep their customers safe. No one wants to make someone sick, and farmers are amazing custodians of the earth and of you as the consumer. So it's really important to a lot of the people who have taken our program. They are very small farms, they dream of hitting that $25,000 in sales mark, but they're not even anywhere close. They just sell a little couple of things at the farmer's market, but they still take this training so that they know what they can do better. And any kind of food safety training you can take, I highly recommend. Even if you're just a consumer, go to your local health department, get a food handler's card at least once in your life and learn, the Fat Tom metaphor, where you have temperature and time and all of those things that are associated with those growth rates of those bacteria. That's why we refrigerate things, to slow down that growth rate. It doesn't stop the growth rate. In fact, you can freeze a lot of these bacteria and they'll still be fine when you pull them out of the freezer. If you think about smoothies, I'm a big fan of smoothies. And if you make smoothies at home, you may have been familiar with the big recall of strawberries a couple years back where they were contaminated with hepatitis A. So they had to recall thousands upon thousands of bags of frozen strawberries, because who cooks a smoothie, right? You don't cook a salad, you don't cook a smoothie. Actually, I'm a weird person because I like spinach in my smoothies, and so I always make sure that I cook it. And so I'll throw in my blueberries for just a little bit to just make sure that whatever's in there. But the problem is that vitamin C is very heat sensitive, and cooking it will kill the vitamin C off. But, I'll take a vitamin C pill just to get rid of the E. coli potential.
Well, I'll just eat an orange. But one of the things you mentioned was strawberries, right? Another low growing crop, a little bit higher as far as risk goes. And what you'll find is when you look at these recalls, many times it's crops like that are consumed raw and grow close to the ground, because that's the easiest place for contamination. Splashing up on an apple tree is much harder to do, but it's possible. And obviously, if you're not washing your hands, then you're just basically rolling it on the ground, just like everything else, or just like, the crops we were talking about that grow on the ground. So you've actually removed that whole safety as far as distance from the ground. But let's say you're not selling stuff at the farmer's market. You're not trying to make it big. You just enjoy doing it. You obviously want to keep your family safe, but you might not be as aware of the points of contamination that somebody that does it for a living has to be. So, just as a small producer, somebody that just has a hobby, be aware of this stuff and understand that, even if you have some doubts on the safety of a food product, the best thing you can do is not eat it. And if you really want to eat it, well, there's ways to prep it to make it safer as well. So keep all this stuff in mind to make the best choices for producing it and consuming it. And always listen to those recalls, because some of the bugs that we talked about, Listeria, E. coli, and Norfolk virus. What is it?
Norovirus.
Norovirus.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all very nasty.
Yeah, and a lot of the food safety outbreaks that you hear about for recalls, they're not even associated with produce. But produce is a large factor simply because, like we've been saying, you don't cook it. And so it's very important to make sure you're washing your produce. Even if you grew it yourself, you should still wash it before you consume it. And pay attention to those things that you like, well, I'm not going to eat the rind, so do I need to wash it? Well, one of the big outbreaks that we had was with cantaloupe, right? And because it has that webbing on the outside, it has lots of little crevices. And these are microscopic organisms. I always loved when we went to the Carnegie Science Center, there was a sign in the bathroom that says there are more bacteria living under your ring than there are people living in Europe. And that just kind of gives you an idea of how tiny they are. They can live in these microscopic places. You cannot see them. And so when you cut that rind on the outside of your produce, a watermelon or a cantaloupe or something like that, you are pushing whatever's on that surface down through the produce that you're going to eat. So it is still important to wash those things where you're not going to be eating the rind.
As an example, deer can come on your property and they can poop on the watermelons or whatever you have out there, and you wouldn't even know it. And deer poop can introduce E. coli. So even if you are doing everything right, sometimes nature can just throw a wrench in it, and just being able to understand that these things can happen and washing it before you start cutting it, well, you've just mitigated that risk. But there's always going to be a risk. It's never going to be 100% safe. So whether you're trying to do the best thing in producing a safe product as a producer, or whether you are prepping a product to make it safe for yourself or your family, understand that these things can happen. And that window to go from, remember, 1 to a trillion is just 12 hours.
Right. And we do want to make sure that we're not leaving you all paranoid and terrified right now. So recognize that very few of the trillions of bacteria out there, there's probably more than trillions, are harmful, right? So there are a lot of good bacteria out there. In fact, even within the coliform family, even within E. coli family of bacteria, there's only a few that will make you sick. So the E. coli 0157 is the one that causes these health problems. And it is just one of thousands of different E. coli that are out there. But we use the E. coli testing as an indicator. So it's why you usually just hear it tossed out there. If there are E. coli, there is the potential of the one that can harm you. But again, there's just the one out of all those thousands that can actually make you sick. So we don't want to scare you to say, oh, I should be totally paranoid about my food safety, but you should still take steps. You need to wash your hands, wash your fruits and vegetables, and just take care of your food at home and on the farm. And if you have any questions about food safety, you can always reach out to your local extension office. And I do really encourage you to take any food safety classes that you can. As a consumer or as a grower, it's really important to learn what you don't know.
Hey friends, we need your help. In order to keep this show going, we need to hear back from you. Please take some time and check out our evaluation. You can either contact us directly for a copy, or you can go online to https:// Here's the tricky part. Capitalize the next 3 words. Extension, calling, evaluation. Again, extension, calling, and evaluation all need to be capitalized. So bit.ly/extension, calling, evaluation. Give us your thoughts. Let us know if you like the show, and especially let us know if you've used any of the information you've gained from our show. Once again, you can reach us directly. You can call Karen at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Or you can reach Dan at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Let us know how you use the information that you get from this show, whether it is change in your shopping habits, a change in your gardening, or simply just expanding your mind. We want to know. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.